Hello my retro gaming friends and welcome to another repair video. In my ongoing series of COVID-19 inspired repairs, which basically means I'm just stuck at home and making my way through my backlog, I have this cartridge of Budokan, or Budokan, however you want to pronounce it. I'll just pronounce it as Budokan from now on. Released by EA sometime and I'm actually not sure when. But anyway. I'm a big fan of a YouTube channel called Retro Repairs, and in that channel, the lovely Canadian that runs that actually does plenty of cartridge-based repairs, which isn't really something I'd considered before finding his channel. I've owned this cartridge for quite a few years, and no matter how much I would clean the contacts of IPA, I could just never get it to boot. As you can see, it's in okay cosmetic condition. The label is a little bit worn and faded and ripped in some places, and there are some stickers about, and the contacts do look a little bit worn. So, without further ado, let me smack this thing into a Mega Drive and I'll show you what happens. I should point out that this Mega Drive has been confirmed as working. I've actually owned it for many years. It is actually my only Mega Drive in my collection. As per what should be standard in these troubleshooting protocols, it was tested with another working game beforehand. And as you can see, turning it on, nothing happens. Inserting and reinserting the cartridge also doesn't help anything, although I'm not entirely sure why it would. But yeah, as you can see, I tried that as well. So let's crack this thing open. These early EA cartridges appear to be just held in by two Phillip head screws. Although one was missing for some reason, I'm not sure, maybe that was the previous owner. The other screw is of course under this sticker, so I'm not sure if the original owner just never figured that out or not. That is a bit odd. But what I will point out is that that sticker was for a video rental store pretty local to my area where I live, which is in a PAL region. So just think about that for a second, as that will come into play later in the video. I very rarely actually take apart cartridges, I just don't really have much of a reason to usually, and I struggled with that little yellow tab that is only found on Electronic Arts cartridges. Regardless, I managed to open it up enough that the circuit board just kind of fell out. And on inspection, there isn't really anything obvious that indicates that something is wrong. There's not really anything on the board at all. There are 2 ROM chips and 3 capacitors. So I guess we'll start with the capacitors. This is a new tool of mine. It is called an ESR meter, and its purpose is to test capacitors in circuit, because traditionally you'd need to desolder them to figure out if they're outputting the correct values. So let me show you how it works. As far as I can gather, it only really works on polarized capacitors. This one here is an electrolytic, and it's 16 volts, 47 microfarads. So looking at the handy and convenient table that is included right on the device, if we follow the table to 16 volts 47 microfarads, it says the worst possible ESR value should be 1.6. So from what I've read, it's good practice to discharge the capacitor before you use this, and you can just use something like a flat-headed screwdriver or maybe a pair of pliers, and then the negative lead simply goes on the negative leg and vice versa for the positive lead. And here we can see that the ESR rating is roughly 0.89, and according to the graph, that is well within tolerance. So if this thing is correct, that means the capacitor is fine. However, I have read conflicting reports about how accurate these things actually are, but as a sort of baseline, they seem to be okay, but I know someone will take huge offense to me saying that. Those 2 small yellow caps are actually not polarized, so I don't believe I can actually test those with the ESR meter. I would have to desolder them and check them with a multimeter. So in the meantime, I just gave the board a good going over with IPA, which I said I've already done with the contacts multiple times, but I thought I'd give the traces a good going over as well. And after that, I did figure out how to actually get that yellow tab off. There's a little notch that can be pushed out with something like a flat-headed screwdriver. Although I'm not sure if I recommend this, as the screwdriver did rip up the plastic a little bit. In my last video, I talked about getting a set of plastic spudges, and a few of you found it funny that I called them spudges, but I'm not really sure what else to call them. Regardless, I did actually end up getting some of those, but I didn't have them at the time of recording this clip. So I gave the cartridge a quick test after this, which I didn't film, but it was unsuccessful. So I got on with testing all the traces to see if there were any breaks. This is certainly a laborious task, as the circuit board is double-sided, so there are traces on both sides, but I checked every damn one of them and all of them seemed fine. They did look like there were a couple possible contenders. As you can see in this photo, there are 2 traces that have little bits scraped out of them, but I can assure you that these tested fine. So with everything clean and tested, the next logical step was to reflow all the solder points, even though they did test fine with the multimeter, but it didn't take very long and I figured it couldn't hurt. So there is a Budokan cartridge out there now that has really great soldered points on them, but this particularly didn't fix the issue. So I started doing a bit more research because, as I said, I don't actually have any experience with repairing a cartridge. And I read that on these Sega carts, you can actually test the ROMs and do what's called a diode test. So there are diodes in these that can go kaput, and you can actually install pull-down resistors if you can figure out which pin is not working how it should. So what you do is you just set your multimeter to the diode mode, and you put the positive lead on a ground connection, and then you just check every single connection and see if there's anything out of the ordinary. On both these ROMs, and I should add that having 2 ROMs on a cartridge does seem a bit weird, but regardless, I checked every single point, and they all came in at about 0.6 volts. So since they were so consistent, this indicated to me that these ROM chips didn't have that particular issue. So with the ROM chips cleared with a good bill of health, I turned my attention back to the capacitors, because really, there's not much else that could be the issue. So I got busy desoldering them so I could properly check them with the capacitance mode on my multimeter. So starting with the electrolytic, because let's face it, it's the most likely component here to fail, and it tested at 58 microfarads, and if you remember, it's supposed to be 47. So I know there are tolerances on these things, but 10 more microfarads on such a small amount in the first place does seem like quite a bit, so I'll be replacing that for sure. And it gave me hope that it could be the reason that this cartridge wasn't working. I also, of course, tested the decoupling capacitors, and these both came in at 100 nanofarads, which is what they're supposed to be. And honestly, I didn't think that they were going to be the problem. These very rarely fail, at least compared to electrolytics anyway. So I had a bit of a search around, and it wasn't too difficult to find a suitable replacement. I then gave it a test just to be sure, and look at that, 47.44 microfarads. That's definitely what it's supposed to be. So I was feeling pretty good after that. That seemed like the likely reason the cartridge wasn't booting. So I popped in the new electrolytic, I put the decouplers back in where I found them, I gave it a good scrubbing down with IPA again just to get rid of the flux, and then I checked continuity just to make sure they were installed properly. And again, I didn't film myself testing it, but unfortunately, it didn't fix the problem, which was a bit annoying considering the capacitor certainly seemed broken. So I got busy researching again and couldn't really find anything, but it occurred to me that I hadn't actually checked to see that the cartridge was running when it was installed into a console, so I pulled apart my Mega Drive and did just that. This is a very simple test, and of course you do need to be careful when doing this because you are working on a live circuit, but basically I just checked that both chips were receiving 5 volts when the console was turned on. And as you can imagine, considering how well this repair was going, they of course came in pretty much exactly 5 volts each. So what could be the issue? Everything's been checked, everything seems fine. I was really starting to get quite frustrated. Luckily, the 16-bit forums came to the rescue. I posted my woes to a thread in the tech aid section of the forum, listing all the things that I've tried, which is what you've seen in this video so far. A member named Chilled answered back pretty quickly and brought a particularly interesting part of the Genesis history to my attention. It's called TMSS, which stands for Trademark Security System. So this is the anti-piracy component of the Genesis and Mega Drive, although it wasn't a thing on the first generation of the Genesis. Now, the exact story of this is a bit he said, she said, and there's a few different accounts to be found across the internet. But the story that I could piece together goes that Electronic Arts, being the big company they were and still are, didn't like the idea of paying massive licensing costs to Sega when the Genesis was first released. So essentially, their first batch of games aren't actually licensed, and because they were so big, they just released the games doing whatever they wanted, and this basically strong-armed Sega into giving them a better licensing deal. It's kind of funny how it worked for EA, because Accolade apparently tried to do the same thing, and Sega took them to court, and won, as far as I can tell. So because these first games are not licensed, and that the first generation of the Genesis didn't actually have TMSS, games like Budokan don't actually support it. So the story goes that this was only on NTSC cartridges. The PAL version, which is the version I supposedly have, came out 6 months later and does have TMSS. So if you try to play the earlier versions of Budokan on something that's not a first generation Genesis, the game just won't boot at all, because the Genesis will see it as an unlicensed or possibly pirated cartridge. This shouldn't be an issue for me, because this is supposedly a PAL cartridge. I'm in a PAL region, and I bought this here, and there is that sticker, don't forget, for the video store that was local to my area. So it can be presumed that this was bought locally and then rented out locally. I don't have a first generation Mega Drive or Genesis, and I'm not actually sure if it works for the first generation Mega Drive anyway. But if you have something like a Game Genie, or in my case, an Action Replay, supposedly this bypasses the TMSS anyway, allowing the game to boot. So at this time I didn't own a Game Genie or a Action Replay, but I've always thought it would be a cool thing to have for my consoles anyway, so I saw this as a good opportunity to pick one up. Luckily, a retro gaming store local to me called Beyond Retro actually had new old copies of this in stock. The story goes that they bought them off some guy who'd just been holding onto them for like 20 years or whatever, and then just wanted to get rid of them. So for $50, which I think is a pretty good price in Australia, I got a brand new copy of this in box with all the original inserts, and the pins on this look absolutely pristine. So that will be an interesting video for another day, I'm sure, but it meant I could test every single possible loose end with this Budokan cartridge. And keep in mind that this game is not supposed to be that good. But once you go deep enough down this rabbit hole, you really just want to see the thing fixed. So I plugged both the cartridges in, flicked the switch, and then held my breath as the Action Replay card loaded. And what do you know? The damn thing is booting. There was actually nothing wrong with this cartridge, it just doesn't have TMSS, so the Genesis wouldn't play it. My god. I have to say that was quite an entertaining finish, considering all the troubleshooting I had done beforehand, but I was relieved to see it working nonetheless. So, after all that effort, how does the game actually play?
This game blows.
Yes, straight from the horse's mouth himself. So all the information online seems to indicate that this is in fact only an issue with Genesis NTSC cartridges. So what's going on with mine? Do I actually have an NTSC cartridge? Well, there is no identifying information on the actual cartridge itself, unfortunately. That was on the original box, which I don't have. So the best I can do is record this footage, which should be in 50 Hz, which theoretically means that it would be running a little bit slow on my PAL Mega Drive. So let's record some footage and then compare it to some NTSC 60 Hz footage and see what the answer to this mystery actually is.
And as you can imagine, the answer is pretty obvious. Comparing my PAL footage to NTSC footage, it's obvious that the PAL footage is running a little bit slower. At first it isn't so noticeable, but when you skip ahead, things aren't in sync at all. Unfortunately, the NTSC footage you see here is captured through a Raspberry Pi. I just don't have the means at the moment to obtain a known NTSC copy of Budokan, but it's the best I can do for now, and we'll just have to do. To emphasize how slow it's going, here's me going through the footage frame by frame, and you can see that both characters in the PAL version do things a little bit later than their NTSC counterparts. So there you have it. For some reason, I have an NTSC cartridge, and on top of that, for some reason it was for rent in a video shop in my little PAL corner of the world. I can imagine it was returned for not working many times. But thank you for watching, even if the conclusion was a little bit silly. But these videos are all about the adventure it takes to get to the end conclusion. Regardless, I'll see you in the next video. Stay safe out there.